I heard it before I saw it with a distinct snip-snip of hedge clippers, followed by a woman cheerfully humming "We Are the Champions" like she was in the finals of a landscaping contest no one asked her to join. My coffee hit the ground as I dashed to the side of my house in pajama pants, already bracing for trouble. There she was, Karen, our neighborhood's reigning ho-board queen, perched on a wobbly plastic stool, dressed in yoga pants and hacking a perfectly square hole right through my 7-foot privacy hedge like it owed her money. When I yelled, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" she didn't even blink, tossing a handful of clipped leaves over her shoulder. She gave me a bright smile and said, "Just making life a little easier for everyone, sweetheart." "You're welcome." That was the moment I knew my quiet days were over, and I was about to become the ho's worst nightmare. My name's Marcus, and I'd moved in 3 months earlier. This was my dream home, just barely outside the ho's official boundary, by a glorious 4 feet. The survey confirmed it. Still, the neighborhood had clean sidewalks, trimmed lawns, and the suburban calm I craved. Working from home as a software engineer, I valued my privacy like most people value air conditioning in July. The hedge around my property wasn't just for show, it was a lush, living wall between me and the rest of the world, and Karen had just declared war on it. After catching her mid-snip, I told her to leave my property immediately. She looked at me like I'd insulted royalty. "I am the whole landscaping coordinator," she said, like that title gave her authority over everything green. According to her, the new hole was a shortcut for people heading to the Ho clubhouse because apparently saving 45 seconds on foot justified vandalizing private property. I pointed out that she was trespassing. Her response? A smug smile and that ridiculous time estimate. That night, I bought some fast-growing nursery branches to patch the gap. I also set up a motion sensor camera aimed right at the spota just in case she got any ideas. My instincts were right. At 2:47 a.m., the camera picked up movement. In the morning, I checked the footage and nearly choked on my cereal. There she was in a bathrobe and slippers, dragging a 6-foot ladder to the hedge and calmly undoing my repair job. She even paused to strike a pose for the camera and mouthed, "Nice try." I contacted the police. The officer was courteous but clearly not eager to get involved. "Technically, it's trespassing," he said, "but unless there's real damage like a tree being cut down, the DA probably won't take it." Apparently, a human-sized hole in a hedge is just suburban hijinks. Karen's next stunt was to march into my yard in broad daylight wielding a measuring wheel and a clipboard. When I demanded to know what she was doing, she claimed she was mapping the optimized route and that the HOA president had verbally approved modifications to my yard. I asked for that approval in writing. She told me to watch my tone and stormed off, muttering something about new residents not respecting the vision. I sent a detailed email to the HOA with photos, videos, and a breakdown of property laws and boundaries. Their entire reply was one sentence: "We are aware of the situation and reviewing it with legal counsel." Translation: they weren't going to lift a finger. So, the following weekend, I escalated. I planted even faster growing shrubs, reinforced the opening with wooden slats, and posted a clear private property a "Do Not Enter" sign. Then I spoke with a zoning official from the city, just to be sure I was in the right. Good news, I was. "You're in the clear," he said with a grin. "They've got no jurisdiction on your side of the line." Just as I was beginning to relax, a package showed up on my doorstep. Inside was a formal HOA notice claiming I'd created a visual nuisance and was in violation of neighborhood harmony. Laughable. The letter even included photos taken from inside my property. They trespassed again, this time to build a paper trail. I wasn't having it. I emailed back a scanned copy of my property survey with the borders highlighted in red, adding a note: "Any further action taken on my property will constitute a legal violation. Kindly forward all future nonsense to my attorney." The next day, my mailbox was egged. Real mature. Later that night, I overheard Karen in her backyard, loudly talking on the phone. Her yard backed up to mine, and I had a mix set up just in case. "If he doesn't tear down the green monstrosity, I will," she said. "We're done with his attitude." I recorded the whole thing and backed it up to the cloud. Then I sent it to a lawyer friend, who laughed and offered to help draft a cease and desist. But I was done playing defense. I didn't just want to push back, I wanted to end this once and for all. The next morning, I sat sipping my coffee, staring out at the ragged hole in my once pristine hedge. That's when inspiration hit. Not just a patch job, or another row of shrubs, and definitely not barbed wire. No, what I envisioned was a sleek, black, 10 feet tall. It would be elegant, yet utterly impenetrable, a modern fortress gate, something Karen couldn't scale, snip, or even complain about without choking on her own hypocrisy. Without wasting a second, I drove across town to a local ironworks shop tucked into a gritty industrial area. There, I met Lucas, a burly guy who looked like he'd stepped straight out of a medieval forge. When I explained my idea, he raised an eyebrow. "You want it tough?" I shook my head. I wanted Karen proof. He chuckled like he'd heard that request before. Back at home, I sketched out a design on my table to a wrought iron fence with elegant spikes, a weather-resistant finish, and just enough decorative flair to qualify as a aesthetic under the city code. I submitted it for municipal approval, and to my surprise, the green light came with barely a second glance. Apparently, having aggressively tasteful boundaries wasn't against the law. And so, my own suburban Cold War officially began. Karen may have started this conflict with hedge clippers, but I was retaliating with an iron curtain. When the first delivery of steel arrived, sunlight glinting off the polished bars, I had a realization that Karen had thought she was just pruning a hedge. In reality, she had planted the seeds of her own undoing. The morning the fence installation began, I brewed my coffee with a little extra joy. The welders began unloading the ornate panels and lining them along the edge of my property. Something shifted, not just in the soil, but in the balance of power Karen had long wielded like a scepter. The sound of clanging metal rang through the neighborhood like a revolution had begun. Naturally, Karen appeared within minutes, marching across her lawn in oversized sunglasses, a pastel bathrobe, and, of course, a clipboard she probably hadn't used for anything other than intimidation. The moment her eyes landed on the iron panels glistening in the morning light, her face contorted. It was the look of someone realizing the rules had changed and she hadn't been given the new playbook. She stomped over to the workers and barked, "You need to stop this right now." They didn't even glance at her, too focused on aligning the posts. When she finally turned to me, her voice was shrill enough to send birds scattering. "I told you this hedge drama was over. Now you're putting up prison bars?" I took a leisurely sip of my coffee, walked over, and silently handed her a folder containing laminated copies of every legal document: city permits, design approvals, property surveys. She flipped through the pages, her brows knitting like she was reading a foreign language. "This is decorative security fencing," I said calmly. "It's approved by the city and entirely within my boundary lines. Unlike your hedge trimmings, this is legal." Her lips twitched. She couldn't argue, and she knew it. Over the next 2 days, my fence installation became the neighborhood's main attraction. Cars slowed down to watch the progress. Some neighbors nodded in quiet support. One even handed me a bottle of wine and whispered, "We've all wanted to do this for years." Meanwhile, Karen was unraveling. She patrolled the sidewalk, taking pictures of the work, harassing the crew during their breaks, and calling the HOA president multiple times a day demanding an emergency board meeting. But nothing stopped the progress. One majestic iron bar at a time, the fence rose. On the third day, I came home from a hardware run to find a bright yellow notice taped to my front door. A letter from the HOA accusing me of violating community aesthetic guidelines, demanding I cease construction and appear for a compliance hearing. I laughed so hard I almost dropped my tool bag. As I had confirmed more than once, my home sat a full 4 feet beyond the HOA's jurisdiction. This was the geographical equivalent of them trying to enforce their rules on a neighboring city. That evening, I put together a concise response. I printed my property survey, circled the zoning boundaries in bold red, attached the city permits again, and included the direct contact number of the municipal inspector in case they had questions. Then I dropped the packet off at the HOA facility, smiling the whole time. The receptionist looked like she regretted every life choice that led her to this moment. That night, I overheard Karen ranting loudly again in her backyard. pacing like she was rehearsing for a courtroom drama that would never happen. My security cameras caught her throwing pebbles at the fence and muttering curses under her breath. I heard words like eyesore, metal monstrosity, and traitor neighbors. Then came her most absurd move yet. One afternoon, while the crew was on break and I was inside working on my laptop, I heard a loud crash followed by a high-pitched yelp. I rushed outside. There she was, a Karina dangling from the top of the unfinished fence, one leg thrown over, the other flailing wildly. One slipper had already fallen off. She had apparently tried to climb the fence, likely in an attempt to prove it was unsafe. But when she realized the spikes weren't just decorative, she froze in place, too scared to move. Her phone had slipped from her bathrobe pocket and landed on my lawn, and I had no choice. See a broken bar. I had no choice but to call the fire department. 2 firefighters showed up, clearly doing their best to stay professional while barely containing their amusement. One helped Karen down with a ladder, calm and gentle, while the other picked up her slipper like he was rescuing a frightened kitten. Wrapped in a blanket they gave her, Karen stormed off without saying a word to me, but the glare she shot over her shoulder said everything. That night, things got worse for her. Turns out one of my upstairs neighbors had been filming the entire episode from his balcony. He uploaded the video online under the title Iron Karen's Great Escape. By sunrise, the clip had gone viral in our local Facebook group, racking up over 20,000 views. If Karen's reputation had been cracking before, this blew it into splinters. The next day, I received a new letter from the HOA. Unlike the last ones, this one wasn't aggressive, it was pleading. They claimed I was disrupting community harmony and asked if I'd consider a less intimidating solution. I grabbed a red pen, scrawled a single sentence across the top, and mailed it right back. Community harmony does not require me to tolerate trespassing. That was the last official letter I got to, but Karen wasn't ready to wave the white flag. That weekend, she hosted what she called an emergency home meeting in her backyard. Folding chairs, a cooler of lemonade, and a dusty old speaker made it feel like a sad garage sale of power. A few board members showed up, looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. I watched the whole thing from my upstairs window, munching popcorn like it was a live drama because, well, it was. I couldn't hear every word, but based on Karen's flailing arms and raised voice, she was trying to convince them I was the neighborhood villain. At one point, she dramatically pointed at my fence and shouted something that made 3 board members immediately stand up and leave. My guess, it was the moment she claimed, "He's building a fortress because he's hiding something illegal in there." By the time the fence was fully installed with vine-ready trellises, solar-powered lighting, and a sleek self-closing iron gate, it had become something of a local attraction. People stopped by to snap photos. One woman even asked if I could share the contractor's contact info for her own home. The irony was delicious. Karen had carved a hole in my hedge to save herself a 45-second walk, and now, thanks to that shortcut, she had created a monument to her own defeat, a one she was forced to pass every single day. A fence she couldn't scale, couldn't sabotage, and definitely couldn't complain out of existence. Then, I got an unexpected call from Lucas, the ironworks contractor. He said a home improvement magazine had taken interest in the project. They were doing a feature on unique neighborhood upgrades and wanted to include my fence. He'd given them my number with my permission, of course. When the editor called and asked for the backstory, I said, "Oh, there's a story, all right, but you might need a few extra pages." Suddenly, everything had shifted. I was no longer the quiet guy minding his own business while ducking HOA threats and Karen's garden shears. Now I was the one who stood his ground, raised the wall, and turned pettiness into a public spectacle. Karen had made one critical mistake. She thought invading a peaceful man's space would be met with silence. What she got was steel. A few days after the fence was completed, I noticed something strange. Despite Karen's humiliating fall from Gracia and the nickname Iron Karen now sticking in every neighborhood WhatsApp group, people were still slipping through the gate, quietly, subtly, just the click of a latch and someone sneaking across like it was routine. At first, I figured it might be a leftover from the construction crew, or maybe a curious neighbor snapping a selfie. But when I reviewed the security footage, the truth became crystal clear. One by one, I watched familiar face as a Karen, other HOA board members, even the HOA president entering my property through the side gate and walking straight through to the clubhouse, like nothing had changed. Even after the cameras, the warnings, and her viral embarrassment, Karen was still treating my yard like a public access trail. I couldn't wrap my head around it. They had sidewalks. They had official HOA walking paths. Why this obsession with cutting through my property? Determined to get answers, I replaced the latch with a digital keypad lock and kept an eye on the footage. The very next morning, Karen strutted up to the gate, typed something confidently into the keypad as if she owned the place, and paused when it didn't open. She typed again, slower, still nothing. She shook the gate. Then, defeated, she whipped out her phone and started furiously texting. Later that afternoon, I received an email from the HOA with the subject line, "Urgent, gate access." The message claimed I was obstructing community continuity and demanded I share the passcode to avoid disrupting the board members' usual route. I nearly choked laughing. Community continuity? That wasn't continuity, that was entitled trespassing wearing a name tag, I replied, politely but firmly. This gate is on private property. Only invited guests will be granted access. Thank you. Still, something wasn't adding up. Why were they so determined to get through my yard? I went back over the security footage this time, focusing on timestamps and faces. Then it clicked. Nearly all of the trespassing occurred between 6:30 and 8 p.m., several nights a week. Always the same group: Karen, a couple of other board members, sometimes the HOA president. And they all carried tote bags or yoga mats. Curiosity got the better of me. That Friday evening, I took a casual walk past the clubhousey broken bar around 6:45 p.m. I took a casual stroll past the clubhouse, pretending to just be out for some evening air. Through the windows, I spotted strings of fairy lights, flickering candles, and a glittery sign that read Namaste and Rose copyright. Inside were about a dozen people holding yoga poses on mats, mellow music playing, wine glasses balanced beside them like centerpieces. And there at the front, a Karina leading the session like some Zen guru, smiling like she'd found her life's purpose. For once, she didn't look angry as she looked proud. But this wasn't some friendly neighborhood gathering. It was a business. I returned home, fired up my laptop, and dug deeper. A quick search led me to a private Instagram account called the HOA Flow, a self-proclaimed yoga and wine wellness community hosted by none other than Karen. There were dozens of posts, some even tagged with GPS coordinates that matched the clubhouse. Comments from locals praised the exclusive vibe and asked when the next class would be. One even mentioned a $10 drop-in fee to bring a guest. And that's when it hit me: Karen was running an underground yoga wine club out of the HOA's clubhouse, using my property as a backdoor entrance for guests she didn't want the rest of the neighborhood to notice. I had her, completely. That night, I called a friend who works for the city's zoning office. I asked some casual questions about using community property for commercial events and whether twinkle lights and open wine bottles violated any fire codes. His interest piqued immediately. From what I described, they were in violation of multiple regulations in unauthorized commercial use, improper occupancy, and fire hazards. He encouraged me to file a report. So, the following Monday, I submitted an anonymous tip through the city's code enforcement portal. I attached screenshots from Karen's Instagram and listed all the recurring times and locations. I didn't hear anything for 2 days, but come Wednesday evening, right on schedule, Karen's yoga circle gathered again. Only this time, their warrior poses were interrupted by 2 uniformed city inspectors knocking at the door with clipboards in hand. From my upstairs window, I watched the chaos unfold like a movie. Karen tried to block the doorway, clearly stalling, but the inspectors weren't having it. They pushed past her. Within minutes, the lights were shut off, the wine corked, and her guests awkwardly packing up their mats. Her little wellness empire was imploding alive. One inspector taped a bright orange cease and desist order to the door on their way out. The very next morning, the HOA sent out an emergency newsletter stating that due to unforeseen zoning complications, the clubhouse would be closed for routine inspection. What it didn't mention was the hefty fine slapped on the HOA or the personal citation issued to Karen for operating an unlicensed business. I thought that might finally be the end of it, but I underestimated Karen's taste for self-destruction. A few nights later, I was jolted awake by an alert on my phone. Motion detected front gate. I pulled up the footage and there she was again, crouched in the dark with a spray can in hand. With trembling fingers, she scrawled the word fascist across my fence in bright red paint. Then she stumbled off, clearly trying not to be noticed. Too late. The camera caught her face in perfect high definition. I filed a vandalism report with the local police, forwarded them the footage, and sent a courtesy email to the HOA. Karen was fined again and issued a formal warning. She was also placed on the community's internal watch list for repeat property violations, a kind of digital scarlet letter that several neighbors found downright hilarious. But Karen wasn't done embarrassing herself. In a last-ditch effort to regain control of the narrative, she started spreading rumors about me. Wild ones. She claimed I was an ex-con, said I had illegal surveillance equipment hidden in my trees, and even floated a theory that I was a secret government agent sent to monitor neighborhood activity. The gossip machine churned, but unlike her fantasies, I had one unbeatable asset, the truth. And now the truth had momentum. One afternoon, my cousin Jonah came to visit. He also happens to be a well-known TV judge famous for his no-nonsense attitude and courtroom zingers. When I told him the full story and showed him the fence, he laughed, snapped a selfie in front of it, and posted it online with the caption, "Respect the iron, respect the boundary." It went viral. Suddenly, I wasn't just a local curiosity, I was a symbol. People started dropping by to see the fence. A few left thank you notes at my door. One woman brought cookies. Karina, once the self-declared queen of the block, was now the neighborhood punchline. Her shortcut fantasy had become a very public cautionary tale. And still, I wasn't finished. Because at this point, Karen wasn't just battling me, she had broken laws, defaced property, and turned herself into a cautionary meme. Now, I intended to make sure she lost every last bit of power she had left. Because fences can keep people out, a broken bar, but cameras let the world see exactly what happens when a tyrant thinks she's untouchable. And right around then, I noticed the mood across the neighborhood was changing. Karen's reputation had shifted from feared enforcer to a warning you told new neighbors with a chuckle. Karen's former royal decrees had become neighborhood lore whispered about like a fairy tale villain who'd slipped on her own cape. Each time I stepped outside, I caught subtle nods of approval, even saw party invites with her name quietly crossed out. Her grip on the HOA was loosening fast, but she still had one last play. It arrived early Saturday. A plain envelope slid under my door. No stamp, no sender, just whole letterhead. The memo tried hard to sound official, sprinkled with phrases like immediate compliance and emergency action. It claimed the board had just revised fence height rules and that my iron barrier now violated structural harmony. I had 30 days to tear it down or face daily fines. Nice try. The document was signed by the HOA secretary whose name was misspelled and who, I happened to know, had moved to Florida weeks ago. So I scanned the letter and phoned the city zoning office once more. As expected, anything the HOA decreed stopped 4 glorious feet before my backyard began. The bylaw was a total bluff. But I wanted more than to brush her off. I wanted a public checkmate. An emergency HOA meeting was already scheduled for Tuesday, so I showed up, envelope in hand. The clubhouse scrubbed clean of Namasta and Erase copyright residue held maybe 20 residents, most obviously guilt-tripped into attending. Karen sat beside the interim HOA president, face neutral but eyes spitting darts. She opened with a dramatic speech about community values, rogue behavior, and how certain homeowners had weaponized independence. It sounded impressive until you looked at the facts, like a house of cards built in a wind tunnel. When she called for a vote to enforce the new fence rule, I raised my hand. I'm curious about the legality of regulating property outside HOA boundaries, I said, stepping forward. Then I distributed packets, zoning maps, city permits, a notarized statement from the real former secretary confirming she'd never signed the threat letter. Karen's jaw tightened as the acting president skimmed the paperwork. He cleared his throat. It seems this matter is beyond our jurisdiction. This agenda item shouldn't even be here. A few people applauded. An elderly woman leaned over to a friend and Stagia whispered, "Maybe we should vote to replace the board instead," earning scattered chuckles. Karen snapped. She slammed her folder and launched into a tirade calling the board weak, accusing me of hiding surveillance gear in my fence posts, even hinting, again, that I was some undercover agent. One laugh in the back set off a chain reaction. Soon half the room was stifling giggles. Karen had crossed from intimidating to unhinged. Security escorted her out, still shouting that I was destroying everything. No one followed. The next morning, the interim president came to my door to apologize for the board's inaction. Karen, he said, was suspended from all HOA duties pending review, and new safeguards were being drafted to curb future power grabs. "Marcus, you didn't just build a fence," he added. "You drew a line none of us realized we needed." Inspired, I decided to turn the line into a symbol of calm, not conflict. I wrapped soft garden lights around the posts, drained flowering vines up the ironwork, and added a cedar archway above the gate carved with private property, a gentle reminder that peace starts with clear boundaries. Soon, neighbors I'd barely met were stopping by to admire the design, asking for Lucas the blacksmith's number, leaving small thank you gifts. One family even dropped off a broken bar, cookies, garage paint offers, and stories began pouring in. Neighbors I'd barely spoken to before stopped by, eager to share their own Karen war stories, the tiny tyrannies she'd imposed over the years. Fines for trash bins left out half a day too long, warnings for planting tulips instead of approved perennials. One guy even told me she reported his cat to animal control because it looked too fat to be outside. Same villain, different petty outrage. With Karen's influence broken, the entire HOA began to transform. The newly empowered board introduced transparency measures, held open votes on actual community improvements, and passed a motion to turn a long-abandoned lot into a shared garden. It was like the neighborhood had been released from a passive-aggressive dictatorship, and my fence had been the sledgehammer that cracked it open. By the end of the month, the clubhouse hosted its first real block party in years. No yoga mats, no passive-aggressive speeches, no choreographed power plays, just kids playing, music thumping, burgers sizzling, and neighbors actually smiling at one another. Someone even half-jokingly suggested I run for HOA president. I declined loudly. And Karen, still there, still haunting her pale pink stucco home, blinds drawn like the last curtains in a crumbling theater. I spotted her once, peeking from behind her living room window as the party kicked off, her face tight, hands gripping the fabric like she could squeeze the celebration away. But for the first time since she cut that hole in my Hedge broken bar, she didn't scream, she didn't throw things, she didn't even step outside. Then came another twist, a soft knock on my door. Tuesday afternoon, I opened it to find a young man in a navy suit with a clipboard and a nervous smile. He introduced himself as an assistant from the county clerk's office. Apparently, a formal petition had been submitted requesting the city override the zoning exemption that protected my fence. It claimed my fence was a public safety hazard, violated emergency access standards, and interfered with community visual harmony. Guess whose name was at the top of the signature list? Karen. I took the packet with a smile, already knowing where this was going. And sure enough, by page 3, I found signature after signature in the same shaky handwriting. Several names belonged to former residents. One was from a neighbor who had died the previous year. Forgery, bold, sloppy, and illegal. I sat at my kitchen table, pulled up footage from my mailbox camera, and there she was, 2 nights earlier, hunched over the forms, flashlight in one hand, a cup of wine in the other, scribbling fake names like a suburban art forger. I compiled everything of footage, petition scans, highlighted zoning maps and forwarded it straight to the city attorney. 48 hours later, Karen received a formal letter. She was under investigation for falsifying municipal documents and attempting to obstruct a legally granted zoning exemption. Potential fines, misdemeanor charges. A permanent record of her pettiness finally catching up with her. The HOA, now entirely under new leadership, acted swiftly. They issued me a formal apology, clarifying that Karen had acted alone and without board approval. They voted unanimously to strip her of all HOA privileges. No more clubhouse access, no event planning, no community resource use. Ever. The notice of her sanctions printed, signed, and sealed was hand-delivered to every resident in the neighborhood. I didn't post it on my front door, but I'll admit I left a copy taped inside my living room window for a few days. A broken bar just in case she was still peeking. But I wasn't done. I hired a landscaping crew to turn my fence into something that wasn't just defiant but beautiful. Flowering archways, soft-lit stone pathways, ivy-trained posts. I called it my victory garden. And once it was done, I threw a party. A real one. Invitations only, backyard string lights, music, lawn games, great food, and most importantly, no HOA agendas, no Karen, just neighbors, laughter, and quiet celebration. We called it Fence Fest. Flyers went out digitally. The RSVPs rolled in faster than I expected. Within hours, nearly every household on the block had signed up. What once stood as the target of Karen's ragia, the iron fence, had transformed into a symbol of something greater: quiet strength, principled defiance, and earned peace. I even brought in a gourmet food truck and booked a local jazz trio to play beneath strings of soft lights. People gathered in clusters around the fence, snapping pictures, telling stories, laughing like neighbors who'd finally remembered how to enjoy each other. One woman joked that the gate should have its own Instagram account. Another brought a cake shaped like a wrought iron panel, complete with edible spikes and frosting vines. By nightfall, the party was alive with warmth. Children played lawn games on the grass, adults sipped wine and clinked glasses, and the entire street seemed to exhale years of tension. From across the street, behind her darkened windows, I knew Karen was watching. She always watched. But this time, there were no threats, no late-night antics, no petty vandalism or furious letters. She was silent, powerless, and she knew it. A few days later, an official letter from the city arrived at my door. The charges against Karen were moving forward. Her forged petition had violated multiple ordinances, and she was being summoned to municipal court. When news of that reached the neighborhood, no one cheered. No cruelty, just a shared, quiet sigh of relief. People weren't hungry for revenge, they were starved for accountability. The day of the hearing, Karen arrived alone. No family, no friends, no whole loyalists to back her up. She tried to defend herself, claiming the petition was misunderstood, that the signatures were symbolic, and that the whole thing had been fabricated by a disgruntled neighbor. But the judge was unmoved. He read out the zoning violations, the codes on document fraud, and reminded her that ignorance was no defense. She was fined, issued a misdemeanor citation, and placed under city monitoring for future violations. As she left the courthouse, a local news crew snapped photos capturing her expression of stunned defeat. That evening, the clip aired on the local news, a segment spliced with footage of her past antics: fence climbing, clubhouse trespassing, even a mention of the infamous yoga wine retreats. It played like a PSA for unchecked entitlement. I hadn't asked for the media attention, but I won't deny that I smiled when I saw it. In the following weeks, calm returned. The HOA, now finally led by rational adults, turned its energy toward actual progress: a better walkway lighting, a thriving community garden, open forum meetings. For the first time in years, parents let their kids play without fear of absurd citations, and neighbors started showing up to home meetings, and not to argue, but to collaborate. And me, I found peace in the little things. The garden around my fence flourished. I added a bench just inside the gate, a quiet spot to enjoy my morning coffee and reflect. The fence wasn't just a line between properties anymore. It had become a monument, not to exclusion, but to clarity, respect, and the quiet strength of standing firm. People would stop as they passed, admiring the design, some even thanking me. One day, a young couple walking by asked, "Are you the guy with the fence?" I smiled and nodded. "Thank you," they said. "We read about it online. You made us feel good about moving here." And maybe that was the real victory. Not the headlines, not the party, not even Karen's implosion. The win was the message that boundaries matter, that respect is earned, that a calm, steady voice can silence even the loudest chaos. Karen thought she was trimming a hedge. Instead, she exposed herself and revealed her tactics, unraveled her authority, and left behind a legacy not of leadership, but of lessons. Ones we'd all remember every time we walked past the gate. Not a wall of spite but a line of quiet, immovable dignity.